And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network here at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership, coalitionradio.us for our digital, or should I say pre-digital offerings, and now coalitionradionetwork.com. We've got a special show this evening. This is someone that I've been attempting to connect with for, probably a few weeks, and we finally worked it out after a couple false starts, so I'm grateful for his patience. He is a candidate for the United States Congress from the Democratic Party in the 2nd District of the great state of Rhode Island. You might say, wait a minute, there is a Democratic congressman representing the 2nd District in the great state of Rhode Island. Well, I guess what we're going to talk about is what representing means tonight. Dylan Connolly is joining us. He's an attorney, and he is a Democrat, and he is challenging in the upcoming week the incumbent in the 2nd District. Dylan, welcome to the Coalition. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, we had a great talk last night. In fact, what we try to do in a show like this is not talk too much, because you want to, as they say, leave it for the show. But let's talk a little bit about your background. When we meet people who are entering the fray, if you will, in the field of battle for high political office, motivation is an important factor. When did you become political? As a young man, what was it part of attending law school? What were your motivations, and what are the causes that you feel most strongly about?
Yeah, I can't say that I was terribly political through high school. When I got into college, I was political science, history, philosophy kind of guy, and started paying more and more attention. And through law school, I was pretty focused on politics. And since law school, I think politics has really heated up in America. And I think you have different responsibilities as an adult. And I got married. I have a son now, and sort of my role in the world is much less as someone that can kind of let the world kind of pass them by. And now I have to participate because I have a lot more at stake than just my own future.
We don't often see, although it's certainly becoming more common here in Rhode Island now, with the emergence of the political co-op, with the emergence of the Progressive Democrats, with the emergence of the Women's Caucus into sort of their own full-blown organizations. We don't often see Democratic primaries here in the state. In the past, if you will, the road to political office was something that was strictly controlled here in Rhode Island, and that may be part of the issue here. Challenging a Democratic incumbent, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about your opponent, but what specifically was it that said, okay, it's time for a change? What issues are you focusing on in contrasting yourself to the incumbent?
Sure. I think what drove me into the race was really what this moment was. I mean, everyone has had their own experience in 2020, but when the pandemic hit, first you kind of recognize a public health crisis, then an economic crisis. Then when everything's turned dark in America, systemic racism rushes to the forefront. And all of those things start to compound. And for me, I'm a big believer that that systems drive people to do things that they may not necessarily want to be doing, or they put people in a position where they don't really deserve to be. And I think what we all see during the pandemic is how universally our systems have put the average American in a bad situation. So I think anyone that's been in office for 20 years is an owner of those systems. They are a creator and a maintainer of the status quo. And anyone that looks out into the world right now and sees the status quo has to be unsatisfied.
Specifically, which issues? What speaks to you? It's a wide open slate here. So whether you're running for federal office, so clearly national issues are at stake. But at the same time, at this level, you assume a leadership in the state party. What issues locally speak to you?
I think fundamentally it's economic inequity. I think a lot of our problems, that is a root cause, whether it's health or if it's housing or if it's education. You can't have a conversation about any of those things without first talking about poverty. So specifically policy-wise, I'd be looking at things like the expansion of the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, monthly stimulus for the duration of the pandemic, a shift to Medicare for all. When you do all of those things, you start to decrease expenses for working families and increase monthly take-home cash. When you do those two things, you kind of give people an opportunity to be a bit more stable. And I think when people think about economic improvement, they tend to consider it to be a linear phenomenon. And I disagree. I believe it's an exponential phenomenon. So small changes in take-home cash have dramatic improvements. And I think that would be recognized in sort of educational outcomes, health outcomes. There's that famous statistic about the percentage of Americans that can't even afford like a $400 car problem. And, people want to talk about the evilness of payday loans. Payday loans in themselves aren't evil. The fact that they're needed is evil. Mm-hmm. It's sort of this level of economic inequity that the system is imposing upon us. And really, that is what's driving me to run for office. I think the congressman, he has, in terms of contrasting positions, it's really about what he's done versus what he hasn't done in office. He's passed a grand total of 2 bills of his own bills. One is to rename a post office. One's to remove the Secretary of Education from the Future Farmers of America. So in 20 years, that's his unilateral accomplishment. From my perspective, this is not a moment in time where we can allow that approach to legislature. We need to take advantage of what I think is a very small opportunity where I expect to have unified federal government with a social mandate for change, the likes of which I may never see again in my entire life.
And that mandate for social change, I guess what we're looking at is several seminal issues at the federal level and how a government comports itself. It's interesting. In his 2 bills, in the words of the immortal, that was a bold strategy, Cotton.
Yeah. Ooh, there is a type of politician that they want to just kind of wait until the political dust settles and then say they were on the consensus side the entire time. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they toe the party line and they raise money. And I imagine that at certain points in history that provides value. But what we see now does not provide value. You have to meet the moment of 2020. This is an extreme moment in American history, and I believe it requires a level of activist legislation that the congressman is not capable of providing.
So let's go down the roster, and myself as an activist, it's interesting. As you know, I'm a libertarian, so in a very large sense, the role, you and I could probably debate endlessly the role of the federal government. Let's not do that tonight. That's probably a great panel conversation sometime after November when the world's at least potentially a little bit more orderly.
Hopefully.
But Bernie Sanders is probably the only, I don't know, potentially politically the only statement I think Bernie Sanders has said, which I embraced, was his mention as disturbances started, civil uprisings started across the country in some astonishing places. I mean, Kenosha, Wisconsin, really? Wow. Yeah. That's how deep rooted these issues are. But he pointed out that, folks were engaging in a varying degrees of physical disobedience and civil disobedience. And he mentioned something effective. I'm paraphrasing, but when met with the notion that people were rioting, and he basically said the banksters have been doing this, rioting and stripping and pillaging for years. Why are you so shocked by this? What role does American banking, the Federal Reserve, all of this have in the current situation we face today, which is, again, a great deal of difference between economic levels, a great deal of disparity, and it would appear the beginnings, if you were not, the expansion of a permanent underclass in this nation, both financially and sadly educationally. What role do the big banks have in that?
Yeah, so I think let's go back to 2008 really quickly and just kind of consider this whole concept of too big to fail. That's actually an anti-capitalist position. Failure is what drives capitalism, right? Being able to fail fast and rebuild. So that is what is supposed to drive American ingenuity. Instead, what we've created is a scenario where the federal government will bail out all big bank risk. So big banks are free to kind of do whatever they want without any of the associated risk. And so that was one of our largest failures. And the flip side of that is the real truth of the matter is that I think Congress's position on business is too small to care. So entrepreneurship in America is no longer a priority. Mom and pop shops are no longer a priority. Small business is no longer a priority. And we can see that by the way the PPP loan was put forward. This is just an example that I like to use about the differing perspective I bring is the PPP loans, the incentives that banks were given to give out the loan was based on the size of the loan. So that gives banks a financial incentive to take a look at all of their largest clients, figure out how to qualify them for the loan and get them the money. So the banks are actually going to their clients with these opportunities. If you switch that small portion of the policy to the PPP loan, the payment that the banks get is based on per loan as opposed to the size of the loan. Now the financial incentive is for the banks to get it to as many people as possible. Then they're walking up and down Westminster and Broad Street in Providence on either side of my house and making sure that every single small business actually gets a loan. So the reason why these big banks have these downstream impacts the way they do is because they can lobby and the average Joe can't. So the Congress people hear from the big banks and they don't hear from the small businesses. And every single small policy tweak like that, they compound over time. So what we've seen is the slow erosion of the working class in America in favor of what I refer to as the investor class.
Are you saying that the Los Angeles Lakers didn't deserve a PPP loan?
I think they may have had access to financing without a government grant.
Whereas, just saying, yeah.
There's a few people. So I'm the chairman of the Providence Board of Licenses, and there's a lot of people that have come in front of me, and I've had an opportunity to meet a lot of small business owners, and I have an appreciation for the amount of hard work they put into it. But what they know is their business. They don't know the financial sector. Large corporations have a dedicated finance guy. The convenience store 2 blocks down from my house doesn't. Mm-hmm. But they need that loan.
It's interesting because ultimately we replicated the same mistakes we made in 2008 and 2020 mm-hmm. when banks were almost, in some cases, hands were twisted to take billions in freshly printed money from the federal government and told to loan it out. And as a result, based on, air quote, risk, based on market factors, which all of a sudden become a consideration when you're dealing with a banking side that's public facing, then those folks were able to achieve a monumental spread in interest with very little downside. I mean, they'd been given the money to loan out. Even if they lost part of it to default, it wasn't even their money to begin with. Why do you think this mistake continues to be made?
So I actually think there's a very clear answer. And so my opponent, this is actually his third economic collapse in office. Wow. First being the .com collapse. Yeah. And so this is why Congress continues to fail us. They prefer reactionary politics to proactive governance. If we proactively governed, we would have taken lessons from the .com crisis and built a plan for the next economic crisis. Then we would have been more ready for the 2008 crisis. 2008, everyone kept on crying, we don't know what to do. Everything is happening so quickly. Well, it's because you didn't have a plan. It's not that an economic crisis happens unexpectedly every 1,000 years. It's happening every 10 years. And we've never bothered to make a plan for the next economic crisis on the back end of the one we're going through. So what that allows lobbyists to do is they sneak in and they say, hey, here's your plan. They do all the writing. They provide all the material. There's not enough time to go through the pros and cons of the legislation. People just need money immediately, and the big banks hand them the plan. That's what we currently do. So if we were actually to seriously take the responsibility of governing as the priority of Congress, as opposed to politics being the priority, what we would be doing now is not only fixing this crisis, but planning for the next one. So that when money got doled out the next time there was an economic crisis coming around, working families and small businesses would thrive, as opposed to just the lobbyists I know in DC.
A lot of these problems emanate directly from bubbles that were not created by a true free market, as you pointed out earlier so aptly. They were created by government interference. Now let's take a moment to look at a bubble that could burst any moment, given the added pressure, if you will, on that bubble by COVID. And of course, I'm talking about the tuition, the student loan crisis that's enveloped this country. Do you think it was appropriate for the federal government to essentially hijack the student loan process? And in your opinion, what impact did increased availability of student loans have on overall tuition rates?
So they've allowed them to explode. What the way the federal government set up student loans is they basically made students a way that schools could get upfront capital and banks could get long-term interest. And there was no incentive to actually provide a meaningful education capable of paying the loan back. So banks loved giving them out because they were guaranteed to be profitable over time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And schools had every incentive in the world to dramatically increase tuition because the money was sitting there. You just expand how many kids you let into your school and you charge them whatever you want because the money's there. They don't even need to have any money themselves. You don't need to actually guarantee that they'll be able to pay for those loans. So what a student loan is now, it's a financial product that gives tuition payments to schools and interest payments to banks and has no guarantee of quality education or even a guarantee that you actually need that education. I mean, one of the things that I propose is right now a forgiveness of all interest on student loans. I don't believe in totally forgiving student loans simply because I know the sacrifice that some people and some families went through to try to pay for those things over time so that they didn't have student loans. Also, if you make things completely free, people tend to overuse them. So in order to have sort of a balance and maintain some level of a market, I think what you do is you have 0% student loans and you make the school secondarily liable so that if the student can't afford to pay for the loan over time, the school's on the hook. That gives the schools the incentive to actually provide an education that will give you sort of financial capacity, not just while you're in school, but over the duration of the length of the loan. And I think that would have a proportionately benefit, a much larger benefit for people who are from communities that may not have the same sort of economic opportunities that someone like myself might have. So I think if you do those two things, you maintain a market, you stop the overuse of loans, you put skin in the game for schools, and the federal government doesn't actually lose out, in my opinion, because college educations cause an increase in income. You pay income taxes. So a 0% loan, that benefit isn't lost in terms of the time value of money because it's paid back in increased income taxes.
Excellent. Folks, if you're just joining us, Dylan Conley is joining us. He's an attorney. He is running in a primary, if you will, Democratic primary, to be the 2nd District Congressional Representative for the great state of Rhode Island. Interesting. That's a nuanced approach. I as a wonk, I love nuance because again we continue to react to these. I'll call it the circle of death as opposed to the circle of life. Balloon explodes. We go catatonic as an economy. The nation's government finds all sorts of ways to pump money into some of the very people who might have caused it. And then what is it? Mm-hmm. Rinse, cycle, repeat. Rinse, cycle, repeat. We find ourselves 5 years later in another bubble, and there are no moral hazards anymore as far as the federal government is concerned. We've eliminated that, particularly in the last mortgage crisis. And again, I understand on a visceral level people's reactions to some of these mortgage situations. I also understand that a lot of them put themselves in these mortgage situations. So there's plenty of shared guilt to go around. What are some of the other issues on a federal level that you are very focused on, and maybe again compare and contrast with the current approach, whether it be our incumbent or just in general how government's approaching it? Obviously, COVID is one of them. What are your thoughts on the government's reaction to COVID?
So one of my biggest problems with the government's reaction to COVID, there's two. Primarily, they did a once-off bill. When you do a once-off bill, so these bailouts, they're all kind of one at a time, right? They don't have repeat payments in them. And what that does is it creates uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So they say that they gave everyone a $1,200 stimulus payment, but that's not stimulus if you don't know that another $1,200 is coming. You hoard that because of the economic uncertainty you're facing. You don't know if you need that money later. Look at where we are right now. Everyone's waiting on the next bill and nothing's happening. So proof positive, people that held on to that money were right to do so. So I think a monthly stimulus payment for the duration of the pandemic is absolutely essential in order for it to be actual stimulus. The other thing that I really disagree with was the $600 unemployment bonus. Now, they did that because they didn't do a monthly stimulus payment. But the dark side of that is they create a financial incentive to be unemployed. This is another lesson we learned on the back end of the Great Recession that we're failed to appreciate. Long-term unemployment is self-sustaining. We're actually hurting workers by giving them a financial incentive to stay unemployed. I would have seriously preferred what I call a back to work share program, where the bonus is for work share. Work share is when you work less than full time, and unemployment covers the remainder of it. You split that bonus that we attach to unemployment between the employer and the employee. So there's a financial incentive to the employer to keep someone employed. The employee isn't losing any income, even though they're working fewer hours, and you maintain those employment relationships. I think a really important thing about maintaining those employment relationships is just sort of the long-term impact it has on people's careers.
Absolutely, as well as the growing sense that since we've saddled so many employers with so many facets of the employee's economic life, things like healthcare come right to mind, that the absence of that employer relationship will mean for many people the inability to get healthcare at an affordable price or at of a nature that they once had. It's we're essentially blowing up a lot of the relationships in within the economy right now that had, well, I don't know if they all stood us well, but at least they were intact. Now what you've got is this growing sense of chaos here in the nation. Are you surprised that Congress has essentially bailed? And I'll throw this at two levels because you are a representative here in the state and you are political here in the state. Right now, you've got the specter in the nation's greatest health care crisis in its history of both the Rhode Island state legislature and the federal state legislature not being in place for either oversight and or additional work. Now, as a libertarian, I'll just throw out there that, I theoretically I should be opposed to any interaction at all, but my problem is on a personal level is that they broke it by the ham-handed way in which they reacted. And to a certain degree, I'm going to throw back at them the notion that they got to fix it. A lot of, freestanding businesses that had survived, in some cases, generations here in Rhode Island, are, as we say it here at the Coalition, on the brink of a nervous breakdown. What would you account for this sudden reticence on legislators who couldn't wait, as the late, great Vincent A. Buddy Cianci would have said it, attend the opening of an envelope? Now, all of a sudden, we can't find them. Where's Waldo? What's going on here?
There's no money. All the solutions or potential solutions to the problem require money, and we have a decrease in money. So the problem that you have on the local and state level is you have balanced budget requirements. So you can't deficit spend. Only the federal government can deficit spend. So with the federal government not backstopping the budgets of local and state governments, the only thing that local and state governments can do when they walk into office right now is to cut spending. A lesson that we've actually learned since the Great Depression is when local and state governments cut spending during economic downturns, they prolong the economic downturn. So that's your long-term macro issue. But your day-to-day short-term issue is I don't think there's anyone in local or state government anywhere in the country that knows what they can do right now without spending money. And the only thing they can do in terms of money is to cut spending because there is none.
Right. Yet at the same time, at least superficially here in the state of Rhode Island, we've got a governor who appears to be hoarding federal cash in order to respond to these budget deficits, while at the same time, I'm not looking to cut human services at this moment in history. I mean, let's just throw people out into the street. And maybe we could start state soup lines again. We don't want that. But at the same time, when you look at the bloated budget for the Rhode Island State House, tens of millions of dollars spent in order to maintain a state house. All sorts of waste. What's that song? I Need a Hero. Is there anybody on the horizon that's willing to step up and say, okay, there's a balanced approach? Austerity, as you pointed out, while desirable for many, will not work. Yet at the same time, there's got to be a happy medium, isn't there, both on the federal and the state level?
It's a great question. I do think in a normal circumstance, there is a happy medium. I do think efficient government and prioritizing the efficient expense of tax dollars is something that we fail to prioritize. In a pandemic, and this is one of the reasons why I was compelled to run for office, is we have a truly unique situation on our hands where you have the need to deficit spend, you have a social mandate for change, and unified government. So all of the things that normally stop sweeping legislation from happening are gone. So you could see, starting in January and for the 2 years after that, some of the most expensive and sweeping changes in federal government programs. And I mean, you're going back to World War II. It is a moment in our history that I'm not sure people are appreciating just yet. There will be, I believe 2020 will be a bright line, and there will be forever America before and after this moment. I believe a large portion of that will be because of the programs that are going to come out of the federal government in the next 2 years.
But the deficits, and what's fascinating to me that is, as someone who's a third party candidate, I say booster, both parties have been spectacularly inept at managing our deficits. It's the fascinating thing about the Trump administration is Republicans were given the opportunity to simply be better. Instead, they spend most of their days shrilling, touting whataboutisms about Democratic predecessors who now, by the way, have either lost or have been termed out. Why the obsession with blaming those that have gone before them with a situation they've had now 4 years to fix is beyond me. To me, it's political cowardice. So, I mean, we are past that line now by many studies, by at least a significant level of research, where we've gone past in terms of being able to service our debt, and at the same time invest in, as a government, in necessary items. What do we do then? Are the deficits just too big to fail at themselves?
Some people would want to talk about modern monetary theory at this point, but I'm not one of them. I'm not yet. I think when you deficit spend, you have to recognize the fact that you are putting yourself into a long-term debt, but you have to consider return on investment. When you're in these economic downturns, it's incredibly cheap for the government to borrow money. So you have a low interest rate that you have to beat in terms of return on investment. So when we consider what we're spending on, we should really have focus on whether or not that's going to have returns down the line. This is actually going to pivot me to something that I think I have an atypical opinion on, and maybe this is a good space for an atypical opinion.
Cool. Go with it.
But I actually think this solution to how we can deficit spend and how we can address climate change is actually the military-industrial complex.
Okay.
Now, the original purpose of the military-industrial complex was to defend us from the existential threat that was conventional warfare. Mm-hmm. Conventional warfare is no longer the existential threat that is facing us. It's climate change. So if we just pivot the military-industrial complex from its original existential threat to the present existential threat, it's philosophically serving the same purpose. The reason why I believe you got to do that is Eisenhower started complaining about the MiG, and we weren't able to do anything about it. The reason why is it is a scale of infrastructure that is interwoven into almost every single congressional district in the country. Rhode Island's 2nd congressional district, no exception. So anytime someone proposes cutting military spending, what they're really proposing to every single congressperson is cutting jobs in their home district.
Right.
So let's do it a different way. Let's actually hire those same companies within the military-industrial complex. You don't change how much money they're getting, but you push them towards building weapons against climate change instead of weapons of war. I think you would see a much greater return on investment for that. You'd actually start to address the climate change issue. And the only infrastructure that I'm aware of that has sufficient scale to deal with the scale of the climate change problem is the military-industrial complex. So there you can spend money, get return on investment, reduce unnecessary and endless war, and deal with climate change. I think the problems start to all kind of coalesce around each other in a way that I would really like to kind of bring that concept to Washington and bring it into the mainstream of thought.
Of course, the challenge is that your competition, the current incumbent, as well as both members of our senatorial crew, receive extensive compensation from said MIC, military industrial complex, who are quite content with the way things are right now. How quickly, from your perspective, in light of that idea, and it's a compelling idea, it just screams conversation, but how quickly then should we be pulling the troops home from all of these foreign adventures that they seem to be on, these endless foreign adventures?
As soon as humanly possible. I think as quickly as can logistically be done. I don't know that we have this sort of conversation in America about policing and communities that are struggling with policing. I think the entire international community has struggled with America being the police officer of the world for a very long period of time. And I don't see the return on investment for the expense that we're pouring out to keep our men and women abroad that we could be seeing if we brought them home. And I think these are men and women that are capable of great things. And we need great things. We just need them at home. I mean, look around. There's plenty of work to be done here.
And you're well to have, if you will, involved our national policing with that same conversation because of the apparent melding of the two. It started out on a very gradual basis post Desert Storm 1, with the advent of surplus equipment appearing on America's streets, to now almost a seamless career path for many from these endless police states into directly the thin blue line. So at the same token, let's just throw it out there, since we're just, and this is great, we're just bowling through all these major issues, and they're all kind of tying together. Your approach to, well, policing. What needs to happen in this nation? It's not working, is it?
No, and it's not working for anyone. I don't think it's working for police officers. It's most definitely not working for communities, and particularly communities of color. But this is, I was having a really hard time thinking through all of this, to be honest. I work with police officers all the time, professionally, and, trying to think through all these different relationships. My wife is African American. So kind of have an idea of the different perspectives on either side, but myself not being directly involved with either perspective. But I read an article on Vox, which I thought was brilliant and really took a very long time to exhaustively walk through. We have created a police force that's providing a service that the community doesn't need. We recruit them to be warriors. We train them to be warriors. We equip them to be warriors, and then we put them on the street and ask them to be social service workers. The way that we have approached our training and request on police officers is to be ready for live fire against bad guys. The amount of time they spend over the course of their entire career with live fire against bad guys is in the 0.1% area. So what we've effectively done is we've trained people for a job that doesn't exist, and they're trying to do that job. But I mean, to every hammer, a problem's a nail. To every warrior, a challenge is a fight. So they're trained to be a warrior and then asked to go into community and not fight. There's a total mismatch between what the community needs and what we've trained our police officers to do. And this is one of those scenarios where systems are putting people in untenable situations, and the individuals are being blamed when really it's a background system that's creating the problem.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the case of young Mr. Michael Clark. He's currently working with the ACLU and a coterie of attorneys. He was a police recruit for the city of Providence, and he was drummed out. And the case, by the way, we're going to be updating our case notes on that this week. But the case is horrifying because in one very real sense, you've got the top brass, some of the top brass, I should say, with full knowledge of the physical and mental abuse of a young man who'd been adjudged in the interview process as nothing less than upstanding. A graduate of LaSalle, a graduate of Johnson Wales University in criminal justice, an aspiring minister, as well as something being a police officer. Literally something, the type of characteristics, the type of interests that we're looking for to be representative of the ideal police officer. But at the same time, this same institution, if you will, that is policing in the state, is being called out for some pretty horrific stuff, including a base level, I'll call it physical torture. How do you, you're apparently very, very well read. I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to read both studies of what happened in Missouri. The Department of Justice in Ferguson case actually conducted two studies. One, which was the events that occurred in Ferguson, and then there was the analysis of the lead up to the very, the atmosphere that was created by policing in Ferguson. And it's this notion that part of our country operates almost in a police state level with the type of routine intrusion into one's lives that is both dramatic, regular, invasive, and at the same time guaranteed to create virtual hatred between the community and the police department. What do you how do we dial that back? Because it's clear that the Department of Justice is not embracing, in my humble opinion, any real analysis of this steady drumbeat of cases where people of color are being killed on our streets, in a nation where there are folks who still insist that all lives matter. Is that a federal problem as well as a state and local problem?
It is a state and local problem, but I think it's going to take federal leadership to correct. I think the issue of policing has become such an emotional attachment for people right now. I think it's sometimes difficult to have the conversation directly, but I think fortunately we just had a conversation about student loans, which I find to be quite comparable, where the student loan system was designed so that colleges could get capital and banks could get interest, and the actual student held no priority in the policies. They were just an avenue towards cash. Mm-hmm. What the Department of Justice found in Ferguson is that people of color, in particular African Americans, were considered just an avenue towards municipal revenue.
Right.
They were being fined, ticketed, penalized with interest rates. And so whatever wealth they did have was being squandered and squeezed by their municipal government. And so the municipal government now has a financial incentive to harass people, and people have every right to fear municipal government because they know that the municipal government isn't looking at them as to protect and serve. They're actually looking at them like they're an ATM. And when you kind of have those structures in place, one of the things that really makes me very angry when I hear some of the rebuff to the Black Lives Matter conversation is when people think that when there's a riot, it's because one man got shot. They don't understand that these protests are about a lifetime of being put down on. And then there's just the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Right. And
people think it's a single incident, and it's just a lifetime of being disregarded and being considered to be a secondary level of citizen. That is our American tradition when it comes to race, is to divide people into classes. And it's a complete violation of what we consider to be that all men are created equal and that we should all have equal opportunity. That has never been true in America. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running right now. I believe this is a special moment in time where we can make it closer to our ideals than at any other point in my lifetime.
Outstanding. The pipeline to prison is often construed as being one that started off strictly with felonious style criminality, when in fact anyone who's been poor knows that it's really, really expensive to be poor in this country right now for literally 1,000 reasons. And so very often that pipeline to prison really begins with a civil infraction that because of the poverty or misinformation or lack of legal services that exist in so many communities in this nation, that it grows to take on a life of itself. And then one day someone drives on a suspended license and is arrested, or someone inadvertently bounces a check because of an unknown fee, or any one of these other reasons, and all of a sudden, congratulations, you're in the game now. You're part of the pipeline. And it's just a question of their sometimes luck and their ability to break out of it. It's very troubling. We've only, by the way, I think we briefly talked about it the other night about, is 45 minutes too long? I've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, and then I have to break for a national show. I'd like this actually to be part 1 of maybe a 2-part presentation, because you see how quickly this has gone by. But, we've also got coming up next week a primary election. When, first of all, how can engage in some shameless self-promotion, how people can contribute, how people can find out about your candidacy, how they can vote for you. And then let's try and figure out in the next couple of days to go to part 2 of this. But go ahead.
Love to.
Go ahead. Tell folks more about yourself, how they can reach out to you.
Sure. For a lot more, the most detailed information you're going to find about me is on the website. That's conleyforcongress.com, CONLEYFOR Congress.com. You can find me on Twitter, Dylan2DC, Instagram, _Dylan Conley, Facebook, Dylan Conley for Congress. And, if you have questions, concerns, want to talk to me more, go on to any of those places. I'm the person that responds to any of the messages we receive, so you can talk to me directly. You can vote on September 8th in person. You can do early voting now. You can go to your local town hall or city hall, and they'll print out a ballot for you, and you can fill out that ballot Monday. But September 8th is the election. And if you are listening and you like what you hear, you got to tell your friends and family. It's really hard to get the word out during a pandemic. I really need everyone to spread the word for me. Excellent.
It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Because again, in times like this, I think it's fair to say that no longer can we assume that local offices focus only on local issues, and no longer can we assume that congressional candidates and or congressmen and women can exist in that sort of cone of silence that's been the federal government for so many generations. The two, brought together by COVID, are inextricably linked, and probably will be for quite some time. So the conversation needs to continue. So let's try and figure out a way we can get back right after the weekend, maybe put together another hour, because I've got 3 or 4 or 5 more areas that I want to go over with you. How's that sound?
That sounds fantastic.
All right. We're going to take a break for tonight then. Again, I'd like to thank congressional candidate Dylan Conley for joining us and really getting into the issues. We are always issues driven here on the coalition. We need our candidates to be having more conversations like this in the public domain. We are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network here at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio, and of course the original mothership at coalitionradio.us. The emphasis tonight is that we are solutions driven, we are outrage porn free. Folks, whenever we have a candidate on, we want to make one thing very clear. We're not interested, if they're an independent or a challenger of an incumbent, we're not interested in their fundraising, we're not interested in their polls. We don't handicap elections here. We don't want to know if you're going to win. We want to know simply why you should. And our candidate tonight has given us an intriguing taste of that. So, folks, stay tuned. At 8 o'clock, we go national with a show geared towards libertarian down candidates around the country. But for tonight, I say goodnight to Dylan, and let's talk soon.
Good night.
Good night.